it's such a pain to be alone and lonely in the rain. And it
Alright, didn't exactly expect this from my last False Water Cobra video on whether they could be a beginner snake or not, but apparently there's a lot more people that want False Water Cobras than I expected. Alright, let's get this started. It's currently 12:30 in the morning, the snakes are asleep, and for some reason I had some compelling feeling to make this video right now. Alright, so let's start off with the fact that false water cobras are colubrids. You can compare them to other colubrids, but to be honest, they're much more active and more interesting than any other colubrid in my opinion. They're kind of known to be a more high maintenance species among the colubrids, but they're actually becoming really common as of pretty recent. Both in my own experience of seeing comments on my last video and seeing things throughout the Facebook group that I'm a part of that I mentioned in my last video, and just seeing things throughout the reptile community about the interest in false water cobras. So one overall trait about them is that they are much more messy and much more active snake than most other snakes that people are going to have experience with. In my opinion, they can be a lot of work, but after you have them for a little bit, you realize that the work kind of goes hand in hand with them and makes it definitely worth it for what they give back to you. So let's start off with feeding. So if you're one of those people that enjoy watching your snakes eat and seeing how much they can eat, then you'll probably love false water cobras because they have like a killer appetite. They usually have a pretty good feeding response where their mood can change like that, from just kind of chilling out to they see their food and they want it very badly. So they love to eat and they accept a wide variety of different food sources. Usually they'll accept appropriately sized rodents, frogs, birds, and even fish. Multiple false water cobra keepers have actually noticed that with their snakes, they actually are more enthusiastic about feeding when they're not continuously fed the same thing. So for example, if you feed your false water cobra like a frozen mouse or frozen thawed mouse like 2 weeks in a row or so, and then you change it to fish or like a frog or something, then they'll be more enthusiastic about that because it's a variety and it's something different. Whereas compared to like a ball python, they will not accept anything other than what they're always used to because they are the pickiest snakes ever. One thing to remember though is that keeping several false water cobras might get expensive with their feeding because they do eat every 3 to 4 days. Buying food for them in bulk would probably be recommended because it can get expensive. All right, let's move on to heating. So while many keepers use heat tape with a thermostat, you should use a thermostat whether you use heat tape or a heating mat. I use a heating mat on one side of the enclosure and then leave the other side just as it is, without anything changing the temperature of it, just because my ambient temperature in my house usually sits between 75 and 79 degrees, which is good for the cool side. And then the warm side I have set to about 92 degrees on the thermostat. I myself and plenty of other false water cobra keepers don't monitor humidity constantly, but what I do have is a large water bowl in the enclosure, and I keep that filled so that he can go in there anytime he wants because they are a largely water dwelling species, and it will help them with shed, and it just allows him to be a mess and throw the water wherever he wants because he does whatever he wants with his attitude anyways. To help with the humidity, you should also usually keep a substrate that holds humidity well. At the moment I use forest floor bedding. You can get it at most pet stores or online, and I also have it mixed with a little bit of eco earth. Speaking of substrate, we're going to move to substrate and enclosure details. So as I was saying before, I have a mix of forest floor bedding and eco earth for the substrate, but I also have that with some moss in different areas of the enclosure. When I initially had gotten Winston, my false water cobra, I had talked to the breeder to see what he had for his enclosure setups and what worked. What him and I have both had in our enclosures now is superworm. You can get a bucket of superworms from a pet store, and then you put them in there and they'll breed and do their thing over time. They actually clean up after the snake whenever he decides to take a dump. They also eat his shed, so I haven't had to clean the cage myself in a while, but sometimes I will end up taking out any extra like shed or things like that if they don't eat it within a certain amount of time. For the size of the enclosure, usually you should have about a 4 foot by 2 foot enclosure for most adults to make sure that they have enough room to be in there comfortably. Right now I have a 40-gallon because he's less than a year old and he's still pretty small, but sometime in the very near future I am planning to upgrade to a 4 foot by 2 foot enclosure, probably from animal plastics. Just remember that adult females are going to get bigger than adult males, so you might want bigger than a 4 foot by 2 foot enclosure if you're looking into getting a female false water cobra. All right, let's move on to breeding. I don't breed Winston, he's less than a year old, and I don't have any other false water cobras to breed, so any information that I have on this section comes from the breeder that I got him from. His name is Kyle. He's really great at breeding, and he's great with helping anybody out if you need any advice or help with just starting up an enclosure for a false water cobra and need any information. He currently runs a Facebook group that I joined in order to get Winston and get into the species. I can always give you guys a link to that Facebook group if you're interested in getting a false water cobra. So Kyle had actually said that he found breeding to be pretty simple, but he does recommend usually waiting until a female false water cobra is about 3 to 4 years old and no less than 6 feet long. Females will reach their full size easier if breeding is delayed, and they will have potentially larger clutches when they actually do lay eggs when they breed. I have notes right here that say what he does when he plans to breed his false water cobras. So he says, prior to breeding, he feeds females heavily and doesn't begin pairings until good body weight is obtained. If your female isn't a great eater and you're unable to get her weight up, he wouldn't recommend breeding her. Even a well-fed and heavy female will be very depleted after laying, so good body weight is important. He says when he chooses to breed, he'll repeat pairings until he sees either at least 2 locks or the female becomes extremely resistant to the male. He often gives a few days in between pairings for feeding and rest, and feels as if this combo of frequent feedings and repeat pairing leads to larger and more fertile clutches. He continues to feed females twice a week and decreases the size of prey items as they approach pre-lay shed, so the shed before they lay eggs. Most females will eat 1 or 2 times after they shed that time, then go off of food approximately a week prior to laying the eggs. Alright, so now that breeding's done, let's move to eggs. After the female's pre-lay shed, you'll have approximately 12 to 20 days before she lays, so around 2 to 3 weeks. After the pre-lay shed is when she'll really begin to look uncomfortable, and it's likely she'll probably stop feeding for a short while. He likes to continue offering small prey items to see if they still want to eat. You can use damp sphagnum moss in an area of their enclosure for laying, or you can add an appropriately sized lay box for their eggs, and the sphagnum moss will make them fairly clean and easy to remove, but occasionally they will lay in random places. They're not always going to go straight to the moss and be like, oh, this is where I need to lay my eggs. By the time that the female false water cobra is done laying the eggs, you should have your incubation area set up. For the medium, he says he prefers perlite, as it is more aerating and less likely to mold. What he finds is a good solution is adding water to the perlite at a recommended ratio of 1:1. So just as much perlite you will have water. You'll want the perlite to be damp and clumped together when squeezed but not dripping wet. You want to try to keep the eggs in the same or similar orientation that you took them out of the original enclosure in when you put them into the perlite. He then uses a small but powerful flashlight to candle the eggs. You want to look for the embryo and make sure it's facing up. You of course want to make sure that you have the appropriate temperature being held in the incubation container. With appropriate temperatures of between 80 and 82 degrees Fahrenheit, he often has eggs hatching between 65 and 72 days. My bad, 65 and 75 days. He notes that higher incubation temperatures are known to cause kinks and smaller hatchling size. Just remember to add water whenever necessary to the perlite and to do your best of making sure the temperature stays between 80 and 82 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, let's move to babies and hatchlings. Once babies have hatched, he will usually keep them together until their first shed. In approximately 1 to 2 weeks, the babies will shed and then he'll separate them. After separating them, he'll begin feeding trials, so seeing if they will eat. Some of them are a little bit slower to starting eating, especially frozen thawed mice. They might require fish or fish-scented pinkies or fuzzy mice. An easy way to scent any frozen thawed mice that you're attempting to feed is by using tuna water. Some small frog species such as cricket and chorus frogs, as well as certain toad species, are the best things for getting slow starters and finicky feeders to eat. If you ever do get a wild caught toad or frog, make sure it's not one that's going to kill the snake. I have cane toads outside my house that are actually known for killing dogs if they eat them. So make sure it's not a deadly frog or toad. And make sure you freeze them for some time. It'll get rid of any bacteria or parasites, and you freeze them for a while before you attempt to feed them to your false water cobra. So that's basically all that we have for the care sheet, or how you would be taking care of false water cobras. So hopefully this video answered any questions you guys had about how to take care of one. Hopefully my audio situation was decent. My last video, some things were getting cut out because I had a stupid noise gate on my old microphone, but got a new setup here, so we'll see how that runs. If you guys have any more questions for me or that I can help out with and see if I can get opinions from other caretakers and breeders, make sure to let me know in the comments and I'll see what I can do. And all of my links are going to be in the description for where else you can find me. Peace.